leader who we have with us today over here is too eminent for me to not stumble once or twice while giving his introduction. So please forgive me. Bhushan sir, let go of IIT Chennai. Not many people do that, in our times at least. And he did his degree in law from Allahabad University. He also did a degree in philosophy from Princeton. But like most true Indian leaders, his true calling was back here. So he came back, and in 1983 he started working with the Supreme Court as a lawyer. He has done extensive amount of great work to improve India as a country. The work he's done as part of the Center for Public Interest Litigations is phenomenal. I will not take much of the time that we have here to spend with him, but we are really honored to have you here, sir. And you've been instrumental even in the Team Anna movement. You've been instrumental in doing a lot of great things in this country. One thing that I would like to mention before we ask Bhushan sir to speak is that there have been various leaders who've spoken to us at SOIL. Most of them are working towards the output aspect, which is productivity, growth, but not many are working towards the input aspect, which is norms, which is policies, which is procedures.
And also the outcome.
And also the outcome,
right? Beyond output, outcome.
And Bhushan sir is doing a great work in that area. So let's have a huge round of applause and welcome him.
So, good evening to all of you here today. It's indeed a great pleasure and a privilege to be invited to an institution like this. And the more I learn about this institution, the more inspired I feel to talk to such a group of students, because this institution really appears to be an institution with a great difference, where the objective of education is not merely to build a career by which you can get a good job and make good money, but to actually improve things in society. If you look at the times in which we live today, one thing is very clear, that these are times of great ferment, times where all kinds of movements are taking place simultaneously. Sometimes movements opposed to each other. On the one hand, we are told by our government primarily and by our Prime Minister that India has now achieved 8%, 9% GDP growth and is on its way to becoming an economic superpower in the world. On the other hand, if we look at the other side of the picture, what we find is that on the Human Development Index, India has been continuously sliding down. This is the index which measures outcomes in terms of access to health, access to education, access to food, infant mortality, children's nutrition, etc. In fact, if you look at the state of children's malnutrition, we find that about 49% children in this country are malnourished. These are the government's own figures. Let me just check this now. Apart from that, if you look at the Arjun Sen Gupta Committee report, which came about 5 years ago, that points out that about 78% of the people in this country live on less than 20 rupees a day. In the last 15 years, more than 250,000 farmers have committed suicides. This is unprecedented. It has never happened in this country in the past, nor has it happened anywhere in the world, not even in sub-Saharan Africa, that 250,000 farmers commit suicide in a time of just 15 years. On the Corruption Perception Index, India has slid from the 74th position to the 96th position in the last 6 years, which means that there are 93 countries in the world which are regarded as more honest than India, including countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. So, the fact that we live in times of great GDP growth is not much to celebrate about, because the outcomes that this GDP growth is giving in terms of real indexes which should measure human well-being, these outcomes are not good at all. In fact, one could even argue that the rate of GDP growth in some senses is almost inversely proportional to the quality of life of the Aam Aadmi or of common people in this country. And the reason for that are not hard to understand. When we embarked upon these policies of economic liberalization in 1991, and these policies, as you know, are called the LPG policies: liberalization, privatization, globalization, in which the emphasis has been on privatization. Of course, liberalization has also happened, but the focus of the government is on privatization. The main focus, the prime focus is on privatization. We were told that with privatization, corruption would decrease. And it would decrease because, with liberalization and privatization, because they said that government has become very corrupt. The license permit Raj encourages corruption. Therefore, do away with the license permit Raj, remove the public sector, privatize everything, and you will have a virtually corruption-free society. But what has happened in reality? Between 1991 and today, corruption has increased hundreds of folds. From a time when Bofors was the largest scam, which was just a 64 crore scam, we are today, every week, unearthing a new scam worth tens of thousands of crores. There seems to be a scam taking place everywhere, particularly in the sector of natural resources, that is land, mining, etc. Now, why has that happened? Why is it that liberalization and these new liberalized economic policies have led to increasing corruption when we were told exactly the opposite? Is there a real correlation between the two? One will understand the reason when you realize that what this privatization has done is that a new kind of business has emerged as a result of privatization in this country. And in fact, everywhere else in the world also the same thing happened, which has in fact led to quantum jumps in corruption. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate in economics, who was also the chief economist of the World Bank, was also the chief financial advisor to the American president, to President Clinton, has written several books. His latest book is actually well worth reading, called The Price of Inequality, which has been published last year. But about 8 years ago, he wrote a book called Globalization and Its Discontents, in which there is a chapter called Who Lost Russia, in which he explains as to why Russia slipped from a global superpower in 1990 to virtually a banana republic within 10 years. And all this happened at a time when Russia was opening up. Its economic policies were changed. This whole control of the state over the economy was loosened, and it was privatized. And he says it was precisely this privatization of the Russian economy which led to Russia becoming a banana republic. And why that happened, he explains, is because privatization leads to, or led to in Russia at any rate, to the transfer of huge capital resources from the government to private hands. And when this happens, when you are transferring capital assets worth lakhs of crores in one shot from public to private hands, and you can do it in any manner that you want, just as in India, mineral resources worth lakhs of crores, which is what the CAG pointed out in Colgate, or this is what happened in the 2G spectrum scam, that natural resources worth lakhs of crores were transferred to private corporations for a song. And therefore, when you do that, there is enormous incentives which are created, enormous incentives are created for corruption, because by just paying bribes of 10% or 5% of that amount, a private corporation can get access to resources which are worth lakhs of crores, whether they are mineral resources or spectrum or land. These are some of the major natural resources which have been privatized on a very large scale in India, and that happened in Russia. Of course, in Russia, because all the industry was in the public sector, all that was also privatized. So the assets of all those industries were handed over to private corporations, and those assets were worth literally trillions of dollars. And Stiglitz points out that it was that process of corruption in the transfer of assets from public to private hands, that corruption just exploded to such a scale that Russia virtually became a banana republic with huge inequalities, with enormous corruption, and this is precisely what has been happening to India also. That this process of liberalization or privatization has led to transfer of several kinds of natural resources, or several kinds of resources which were with the government and the public sector into private hands, which are huge. which has led to not only enormous corruption but has led to all kinds of other problems as well. To give you the example of mining or mineral resources, if you see what this policy, in fact I was in Oxford recently and I happened to go to Manmohan Singh's college where he had done his PhD, called Nuffield College, and his dissertation was kept there, and I happened to take it out and have a look at it, and the title of his dissertation was India's Export Performance 1952 to 1962, in which broadly, it was a clerical kind of dissertation, but broadly his thesis was that India's export performance during these 10 years has not been very good. And one of the reasons for that is that we did not really expand the export of our mineral resources. And sure enough, immediately after becoming Prime Minister or immediately after becoming Finance Minister, he started opening up the mineral resources sector to the private sector, because prior to that, mining and natural mineral resources were entirely or almost entirely with the public sector. After that, that whole sector was liberalized, the areas of mining leases which could be given were increased enormously, etc. And thereafter all these mining leases in coal, iron ore, bauxite, etc. started being given to private corporations on a very large scale. Now what has that done to the economy? What has that done to the GDP? What has that done to the environment? What has that done to inequalities is important to understand. In the first place, see, when you transfer mineral resources to private corporations, the first thing that happens is, of course, corruption increases, because there is a huge scope for rent seeking in this. Huge incentives are created for corruption and bribery. Then you have to displace. Of course, the private sector is only interested in profit maximization by and large. So therefore, they want to get hold of those mineral resources and extract them as quickly as they can and sell them as quickly as they can. If they can't be sold in the country, they would like to export them as quickly as they can. And this is what has happened. In iron ore, for example, from Karnataka, which was the richest iron ore area, Bellary, in the country, more than 50% of the mineral of the iron ore was being exported mostly to China. So first you have to displace the people who are living on top of that land, and that has led to the impoverishment and rather complete destitution of the people living on those lands, and these are mostly Adivasis. Because most of if you look at the mineral map of this country, you find that most of the minerals are in the forest areas where by and large Adivasis live. These are the most, in some senses, the poorest people, in other senses not really the poorest people, because they at least have access to natural resources, they are living in forest areas, there are good streams and water sources there. So, though they do not live what we consider modern lives, but otherwise they live fairly happy lives if you allow them to live that way. But what has happened is that a large number of them have been forcibly displaced, primarily because of their lands being given to mining corporations. And those who have been displaced, they cannot really be absorbed. They are told that, well, they will get jobs in this new economy, etc. But they do not get jobs, and they are not even fit to get the kind of jobs that are opened up in the new economy. And therefore, they are left with really two options. One is to either move away because they are dependent on their livelihood for their livelihood on that land. So either they move away and starve to death, or they fight to save their land. And when they fight to save their land, there are all kinds of movements. Even today you read in the newspaper that there are these tribals who are fighting to save their land from POSCO. POSCO is this Korean steel giant which is being given huge areas in Odisha for iron ore mining, for the steel plant. There are tribals who do various kinds of cultivation there, who are resisting the takeover of their land. And now, of course, paramilitary forces have been sent, 14 companies of paramilitary forces have been sent to clear them off their land. Now, when you do that, what choices do they have? Their choices are either to run away and starve to death, or now that they have failed in their attempt to peacefully stop their eviction from their land, the only other choice left to them is to join the Maoists. And therefore many of them have joined the Maoists. In the last 20 years, during this period of economic liberalization, the number of tribals who have joined the Maoists because of this kind of forcible displacement and atrocities heaped upon them by the state is really tens of thousands. And today the Prime Minister calls them the greatest security threat to this country, internal security threat to this country. And who has created this security threat? It's precisely the government and their policies that have created this security threat. Because they have been forced. You have left them no option but to pick up arms and fight. So this is the second impact of these kind of policies, this mining policy in particular I am talking about. The third impact is that you have to thereafter cut the forest, destroy the forest. You have to, and when you mine, you not only destroy or pollute the water, but you sometimes or usually also destroy the sources of water, because mostly these ores, bauxite, iron ore, etc., are like sponges. So they trap the rainwater and a lot of streams come out of these areas. The forest traps the ground, the rainwater, even the ore traps the rainwater and thereafter it flows out. So when you destroy this or extract all this ore, you are destroying the water sources, you are polluting the water, you are polluting the air, you are destroying the forest, therefore you are devastating the environment. And that is what has been done if you look at iron ore mining in Karnataka, there are reports of the Lokayuk there are reports of the centrally empowered committee of the Supreme Court. Same thing has happened in Goa. Wherever you see where large-scale mining has taken place, it has led to complete devastation of the environment. It has led to enormous health impacts on people living in thousands of square kilometers in that area. And then you are permanently depleting the reserves of minerals in this country, such that in Karnataka, for example, Justice Santosh Hegde, who was the Lokayukt, he pointed out in his report that if iron ore mining goes on at this rate, all the iron ore of Karnataka, which is the richest iron ore bearing area in the country, would be over in less than 15 years. So you are leaving absolutely nothing for future generations of this country. Exhausting, destroying and exhausting everything. Of course it will lead to GDP growth, because whatever you extract, it's like selling off your family silver. When you sell it, yes, it goes into your GDP calculations, But the fact that you have depleted your resources, that is not subtracted from your GDP calculations. So therefore, GDP growth will take place, but your mineral resources would be exhausted in less than a generation, leaving nothing for future generations, sort of completely destroying this whole concept of intergenerational equity. And lastly, you are creating such huge inequalities as a result of this, because all these resources worth lakhs of crores come to be captured by a few people, by a few corporations. Reliance today, Reliance or Vedanta or Kane India today control virtually 70% of the oil and gas resources in this country, worth tens of lakhs of crores. This a few mining corporations like Vedanta or Jindal etc. control 50% of the mineral resources in this country, again worth tens of lakhs of crores. And you have created therefore such huge inequalities, and these inequalities result in creating a mafia. It's a mafia. Reliance or these, if you look at what happened in Karnataka, these Bellary brothers or the Reddy brothers as they are called, who were the mining barons of Bellary, they acquired such enormous sums of money as a result of control of mining there, that they became a law unto themselves. Not even the chief minister could do anything to them. Once when the chief minister tried to remove them from the cabinet, they took away more than half the MLAs with them and threatened to bring down the government. Every law, every institution, including the bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary, then buckles down before them. And that's what has happened with a company like Reliance. Ministers are appointed with their consent. Ministers are transferred at their instance. Secretaries are appointed only with their consent. Regulators are appointed only with their consent. They control the police, they control the judiciary to a very large extent, and they are a law unto themselves. They have become the single largest, in my view, the single largest security threat, not just to the country, but to the very concept of democracy itself. They sit on top of the entire ruling establishment of this country. So what you have done by these policies is, you have created a corrupt mafia which sits on top of the entire ruling establishment of this country and has become the single largest threat to the functioning of democracy in this country. When we started this anti-corruption movement 2 years ago, the idea was that in order to control corruption, of course we needed to change these policies which are creating more incentives for corruption. These kind of policies of handing over natural resources to private corporations, policies of creating private monopolies in the name of public-private partnerships in electricity distribution, water distribution, etc. We have created private monopolies in the guise of public-private partnerships, because these are state-mandated monopolies. Electricity you have to buy only from one company, and that company is a private company, so you have to pay. Either you pay, even if they charge you 10 rupees a unit, you pay, or your electricity is cut. Same thing about water. Nobody can survive without water, and if they start charging you today, the charges are 4 rupees a kiloliter. With privatization, the charges, even in the last 10 years, the charges have been increased by 10 times in the run-up to privatization. And they will go up by another 10 times within the next 5 years if full-fledged privatization of water takes place. So therefore, you have no choice. Either you stay without water and nobody can stay without water, or you pay whatever they demand. And this model that, well, there will be a regulator to regulate the prices, etc., this has failed totally, because you have created huge incentives for corrupting the regulator. Because the regulator just needs to be bribed a little bit and he can give you a profit of any amount. If you allow the electricity prices to be increased by 10 paisa, it means several hundred crores of extra profits to these electricity companies. So, at one level, of course, the policies have to be changed if you want to reduce corruption, but at the second level, the institutions which were created for investigating corruption and holding the corrupt officials to account, that is the CBI, the CVC, the judiciary, these have failed. And one of the major reasons why they have failed, or at least the CBI, which is the main investigative agency, failed, was because the CBI was controlled by the very people whom it was supposed to investigate. So Chidambaram, as Home Minister, used to decide whether there would be, who would be posted in the CBI, who would be transferred from the CBI, who would be promoted, against whom disciplinary action would be taken, and the CBI was supposed to investigate Chidambaram in the 2G scam. How do you expect it to investigate? There was a joke going around that the CBI director went to Chidambaram's office and he was asked to wait, then he was allowed to come in. And he said, "Sir, we need permission. Sir, we need your permission to investigate you." So the Chidambaram said, "Well, what would you like to have? Tea, coffee, transfer, promotion, or suspension?" So that's why the main thrust of our anti-corruption campaign, the Lokpal campaign, was that we need to have an investigative agency completely independent of the government, so that it could credibly and independently investigate senior functionaries of the government. The campaign was very successful. It was one of the most successful public campaigns of our times. The most successful public campaigns of our time. Literally lakhs or perhaps even crores of people came out on the streets across the country in support of this campaign. Every public opinion poll, survey or referendum that was conducted by several media organizations showed that at least 80% people supported the Jan Lokpal bill. And yet the government brought a legislation which was at complete variance from the Jan Lokpal bill. Though they called it the Lokpal bill, we have called the government's bill a promotion of corruption bill, or the protection of corrupt public servants bill, because far from creating an independent, empowered and accountable investigating agency against corruption, what it does is to create an agency which is still at least appointed by the government, which has no investigative powers of its own, which has to rely upon investigating agencies which are still controlled by the government, and whose accountability essentially is largely to the government, and where you have created further layers of protection for the corrupt public servants by saying that even before anybody can register an FIR against a public servant, you have to first give them an opportunity for hearing and so on. thereby virtually crippling the powers of search, seizure, traps, etc. So you have created further, and on top of that you say that if the complaint made against the corrupt public servant is found to be false, frivolous or vexatious, he can be sent to jail. What we eventually realized in May last year, we did an internet search and we found that at least 15 cabinet ministers have very serious corruption charges pending against them. That is roughly half the cabinet. And they were not being investigated by anybody at all. They're naturally not being investigated because the investigative agency was controlled by those very people. And the refrain of the government for this campaign, for getting them investigated by an SIT, the government just scorned it and said, who are you to tell us that we should investigate these people? We are in government, we are in parliament, we will decide who is to be investigated, who is not to be investigated. We will decide what kind of Lokpal bill is to be passed. Who are you to tell us? Unelected members of civil society, they called us. We are the elected representatives of the people. If you have the guts to defeat us in elections, you come to parliament, then you can make the law that you want, then you can investigate whoever you want. This was their arrogance, because they felt that election is a game in which only they can succeed, because I am saying not merely the Congress but the main parties, even the BJP or the Samajwadi Party and the BSP, etc., they were all in the same boat. They felt that this is a game which these people, these anti-corruption campaigners, they can't play, because this is a game which can only be played with a lot of money and muscle power, and therefore they can't defeat us, and therefore this was their arrogance and this was their refrain. When we said that, look, why don't you have a referendum after all on this issue of the Lokpal? This is a democracy, you call yourself a democracy. In a democracy it is ruled by the people. Let's see what the people of this country want. They said, no, this is democracy, representative democracy, where the people elect their representatives and then the representatives decide. And what we were finding was that, of course, people get elected, only large parties with a lot of money were normally being able to get their candidates elected, but after election, these candidates, etc., did not bother about what the people wanted, who had elected them, and they were deciding things on the basis of whoever was bribing them or whoever was in a position to influence them there, large corporations, etc. And therefore this question arose as to what is the nature of this democracy where the authority of the people or the right of the people is only to cast their vote once in 5 years, and thereafter the people have no say, no role in what kind of laws, what kind of policies, what kind of decisions will be taken. And therefore we said that, well, one of the other reforms that we need, quite apart from this anti-corruption law, is to empower the people of this country directly to take such decisions through initiatives and referendums, etc. But even that, of course, these people are not prepared to concede. What to say of that? Even the limited recommendations made by the Verma Committee about this crimes against women for amending the Representation of People Act to exclude those candidates who have charges framed against them for rape and other serious offences, even those recommendations are not being accepted. So what we realized was that while campaigns can take us somewhere if our demands are not such which threaten the very basis of this corrupt establishment, that is, if you are seeking a Lokpal which if brought into place will send half of them to jail, that they will not allow under any circumstances. However big your public campaign, even if they are threatened by losing power in the next election as a result of your campaign, they are not going to bring this legislation. Similarly, any structural change in the functioning of our democracy, which reduces the role of money power, muscle power in elections, which empowers people to take decisions directly about laws, policies, etc., about nuclear power plants, whether there should be a nuclear power plant in your backyard or not, people have no say in that. But if you want to empower the people to have a say in that, those changes will not be brought about by this corrupt ruling establishment which is ruling this country today, however big a public campaign you are able to bring. And this government's response to the women's issues has also shown that. Because the main changes that were required were to implement police reforms, which had been recommended as far back as in 1980 by the Dharamvira Committee, and thereafter successively by several government's committees, and thereafter by a judgment of the Supreme Court in 2006. But those will never be implemented. Judicial reforms will never be brought, but some minor changes here and there have been agreed to, and it is being touted just as the government's Lokpal bill is being touted as a Lokpal bill, though in our view it's a promotion of corruption bill. Similarly, this is being touted as a great step taken by the government to enforce or to deal with crimes against women. So at that stage we realized that now the only option, of course campaigns are important, people's movements are important. In fact, people's movements and all this against POSCO, against Vedanta, against so many have been able to stop or at least delay many of these destructive projects which have been sought to be set up in this by the government. But along with all these campaigns and people's movements, etc., we have to ultimately challenge the establishment by way of an electoral challenge. And without that challenge, we will not be able to make those fundamental changes in the functioning of our democracy, which are necessary if we want to save this country from anarchy and destruction. Make no mistake about it, this country today stands at the brink of anarchy, at the brink of anarchy. And if this situation which exists today continues for another, in my view, even 5 years, we will be where Pakistan is today. We are just 5 years behind Pakistan. We would be in as much disorder, chaos as Pakistan is today in just another 5 years if this kind of absolutely rampant, blatant corruption is not arrested in the next 5 years. And that is why we had to decide that we have to take up. There is no other option. There are only two kinds of revolutions possible anywhere in the world. One is this violent revolution which happened in Russia, which happened in China, but did not eventually lead to a very good outcome. It certainly did not lead to democracy. Whether it can happen in India, the Maoists are wanting that kind of revolution. Whether it can happen in India or not is still very difficult to say. Certainly what can happen and what will happen is anarchy. Whether that revolution will succeed, one can't say. But even if it succeeds, it is not going to lead to democracy, it is not going to lead to a better society. The only non-violent revolution possible in this country is an electoral revolution. And that electoral revolution, and that is why we felt that now the time has come to at least try or strive for an electoral revolution in this country. Somebody has to bite the bullet, somebody has to pick up this gauntlet, and that is why Arvind Kejriwal and his group of friends picked up this gauntlet from this anti-corruption campaign. People like you, the youth of this country, especially the educated and sensitized youth. I know that in this institution, the kind of education that you get, the kind of exposure that you get with various NGOs, and even the kind of teaching that you have, sensitizes you to what is happening to the armed army, to the common people of this country. People like you and other young people in this country have the greatest stake in the future of this country, because you will have to live most of your life in this country. And therefore, whether this country descends into full-blooded anarchy where everybody is going to get affected, nobody will be able to escape the effects of that anarchy. In Pakistan now, most well-to-do people of Pakistan are now wanting to flee that country because of the threat and the danger to themselves. So therefore, it is the youth of this country who have the maximum stake. It is the youth of this country who have the maximum energy. It is the youth of this country who have the maximum new ideas and innovation and capacity for innovation of how to face this challenge. It is an enormous challenge. As I said, there are two kinds of movements or forces simultaneously in this country. There is this whole onslaught, the neoliberal onslaught, which is taking place, which is leading to greater inequalities, leading to destruction of the environment, leading to enormous corruption, leading to this displacement and destitution of the poorest people in this country and virtually forcing them to pick up arms. On the other hand, there is also a very vibrant civil society movement or movements going on in this country, across the country, on various issues. There are movements resisting nuclear power. There are movements resisting forcible displacement and land acquisition. There are movements resisting mining and environmental threats, etc. They are very, very vibrant movements. And now, of course, there is also this movement for changing the whole, because the policy of, or rather the vision of this new party, the Aam Aadmi Party, is not merely to just come to power and run a better or a cleaner government. We are committed to changing the very nature of our democracy, the very functioning of our democracy, by instituting constitutional and legislative changes which will decentralize power to the lowest level possible and which will give power to the people directly to decide their laws, policies, as well as take major decisions like nuclear power plants, etc. As to whether a nuclear power plant will be built in their backyard or not is a decision which normally needs to be, at least the veto power for that has to be left to the people who are going to be directly affected by that plant. So, and we are also committed to fundamental changes and structural changes in our judiciary, in our bureaucracy or civil services, and in our police. All these institutions were set up by the British not as instruments of service to the people, but as instruments of control over the people. And one major structural defect in those institutions is that they are not accountable to the people at all, they are only accountable to the top. We need to restructure these institutions and make them accountable to the people. So, of course, this is a huge challenge, this is a very difficult task. Whether and to what extent it will succeed, nobody can say. But if it is to succeed at all, if we are at all able to stop this sort of this dive to destruction, then clearly the youth of this country, especially educated and sensitized youth of this country, have a major role to play. People like you have to provide leadership in these campaigns or in these movements. And it is only when that happens, it is a huge challenge, it's a huge opportunity, the stakes are very high. As I said, we stand at the brink of anarchy. Whether we will survive as a country, as a society or not, will depend largely on people like you in this country. I am sure that you have that capability to pick up that challenge. You have that sensitivity to want to pick up that challenge. And I assure you that if you do, one of the qualities of leadership is boldness and this confidence that, well, this is what needs to be done and we will do it. We don't need to worry about the costs or consequences for us. That's the quality that a person like Arvind Kejriwal has displayed. That he has shown himself to be not only totally committed to public welfare, but that quality of absolute fearlessness, boldness, steadfastness in his vision is what leadership really requires. And I'm sure that if people like you pick up that gauntlet, we will be able to not just stop this descent to anarchy, but really make a society which will be much more just, equal, where sustainable, etc. Thank you very much.
I have a question. Like you told that as of now we have the distribution of power according to the it lies with judiciary, legislative, and the executive. So if you are talking about power split, like if you are trying to bring a new power, like Lokpal bill, if you talk, the Lokpals will be an independent source of power. And don't you think that this sort of power will be too strong for a committee to handle?
Yeah. So let's take a few more questions, or should I answer one by one? Well, this is a simple answer. You see, in our constitution today, there are several independent watchdog institutions that have been made. For example, the Election Commission. So, Election Commission's power is only to be in charge of the conduct of elections. Similarly, we have a Comptroller and Auditor General whose power is only to audit the accounts. So similarly, we will have a Lokpal whose power will be only to investigate cases of corruption and prosecute those who are corrupt. Their power will be much less than the power. Judiciary today is also independent of the government. It enjoys every kind of power, including the power to quash any government decision, to quash a law, to quash a policy, and also order the government to do anything or not to do anything. You need these independent institutions in order for the remaining institutions to function properly, to function honestly, etc. So there is no problem with that.
You had spoken about decentralization of power and involving people in decision making in the future course of action if your party comes to power. It is definitely a wonderful thought, but then however I had this doubt in my mind, if it is done, are our people, that is society, Indian society, is it literate enough to handle such decision making? Because if you take the incident of Telangana, the people in Andhra, that is the Telangana people, they are instigated by the politicians. It's not that they are very much aware why they are participating in a particular moment or something. So such a thing should not happen. So don't you think that it also needs some groundwork?
You see, firstly, when you empower people, when you give people the power to decide things, then automatically people try to understand those issues. There is much more public discussion about those issues because once people know that it is in their hands to decide whether Telangana will be made or not made, they will be the final deciders. Then this issue as to what are the pros and cons of having an independent Telangana, etc., would be discussed much more by the people. By and large, you see this view that people are illiterate or are not intelligent enough to understand these issues, even let's say nuclear power plant. Now it is true that most people will not understand the technicalities, but most of these MPs also don't understand. Do you think Lalu Prasad Yadav understands, or any of these 90% of the MPs will not understand the technicalities of nuclear power? But when they know that this decision is for them to take, whether this Kudankulam will be set up in their backyard or not, then they try and understand. There are debates, discussions, different leaders come and speak about it, and broadly they understand. And even if they don't understand, they understand who are the leaders that they can trust, who are the people who are speaking the truth, who are the people who have a vested interest, who are the people who don't have a vested interest. At least these things they are able to understand. So they will say, alright, I trust this person the most. For example, suppose there was a referendum on the Lokpal. Many people will not understand what the Lokpal or the provisions of the government's bill are or our bill are. But they will understand whether they trust Kapil Sibal more or whether they trust Anna Hazare more. So this much they will understand. So therefore they will vote in accordance with whom they trust, which is all right in a democracy. Even when you are voting for your representative, you often don't know him. You vote on the basis of what party he belongs to. So therefore that's all.
Thanks for the lovely talk. I'm a first generation entrepreneur and I am trying to set up a business. I'm not a student here. I was invited for this talk. So I'm really passionate about what you're trying to set up, and I've been attending Pragati Maidan sessions in Bombay and Delhi. So one reason, what you're trying to set up is that you have a very good core team, and there might be differences in individual issues. But one strong ingredient in your success, as I see it, is, let's say, how do you convert this bunch of 20 guys to, let's say, 20 lakh guys? Or how do you convert people who kind of agree in the vision that you have set, come and join your movement? So the challenge there is, how do you incentivize people to come and join, give you time, give you money, give you kind of efforts, And what I don't see currently, maybe you have that in the plan, if you can share that, that'd be great. How to incentivize people who are passionate about this, want to see India not go the Russia way, but go, let's say, the Mexico or the US way. So what is the plan in place wherein, let's say, people like me can probably start devoting one full day to, let's say, organization, the Aam Aadmi Party? And how do you convert this 20 to 20 lakh people?
Yeah, so for that also we need volunteers like you, or volunteers who can help us in devising ways of reaching out to people. We are trying to do it the best that we can. We are trying to enroll more people who can help us in devising these systems, using technology, using the internet, door-to-door campaigning. We are trying to set up our units in as many states as possible, in as many districts as possible, and we are trying to tell them how they can use various methods of communication in order to reach out and enlist. But it's not very easy to rapidly grow an organization. However, we certainly need more and more bright, enterprising, innovative people to help us in devising ways of doing that. So people like you would be very welcome in engaging with this process.
Maybe a follow-up question. So essentially, instead of a pull strategy, so you say that people like you will be welcome. So while it's a welcome, so it's like it's incentive. The trick is how do I'm incentivized enough to kind of come to your door myself. And let's say not just me, but let's say hundreds of people like me. And how do you set those incentive structures that if I do it, there will be a set of things that I will achieve for myself, or everybody does that, and that is in line with their own professional goals or own career goals in a way.
Yeah, you see, whoever engages with this kind of work would have to do it not for the purpose of any kind of self-advancement in that sense, but for the purpose of a larger cause, and a larger cause which goes well beyond themselves. Of course, whenever you engage, there is also self-improvement, in the sense that everybody learns many things by engaging with this kind of process. But beyond that, one should not do it expecting that one can advance one's career prospects or any other prospects as a result of that engagement. That engagement is for the purpose of trying to improve society. In that process, everybody learns many things, and that learning contributes to the development of your personality, your understanding about things, etc., but not necessarily self or improvement in your job prospects, etc. So it has to come from a motivation which is really selfless.
So, your speech, you are saying that before taking any important decision, you have to have public referendum. But don't you think that it's difficult to take public referendum from 1.2 billion people? Because normal election process itself will take about a week.
Yeah, we have. You see, today technology has become such that you can actually, using your UID, for example, or biometric identification, people can vote even from an internet kiosk. You can devise a system by which you can set up internet kiosks in every village in this country. That can be done certainly within a year. You can set up without too much cost. And with biometric identification, people can vote. And you can vote on different issues every week if you want. Suppose there is a local issue on which people need to vote, they vote on the local issue one week, next week there is a issue which involves the state, they can vote on that in the state. If it's an issue which involves the whole country, they can vote on that also. So that's not a problem. And in any case, you see, these referendums and initiatives will not happen every day. They will happen on some very important issues. This system is in place in most democratic countries in the world. Initiatives and referendums, it is called. In fact, we had written a paper about this. It was published in the Economic and Political Weekly about 8 months ago. You can look at that paper. It's called Initiatives and Referendum, which tells you how the system works, what its difficulties are, how those difficulties have been overcome. Switzerland is one of the most advanced countries practicing this model, and though they are not using this technology, but I am saying we can certainly use this technology by which, so far as the logistics of voting is concerned, that would not pose any kind of problem. That can be done quite easily, that can be surmounted quite easily with technology today.
So what is your take on conscious capitalism? Because you told either we can change, we can bring about a change by acting in the violence or in the non-violence by being the government, winning in the elections. So there is one more aspect also which these students are taught, the ethics and conscious capitalism. So what is your take on that?
Whether we have capitalism.
How to encourage conscious capitalism? Because
what do you mean by conscious capitalism?
Conscious capitalism is in the sense companies operating for a higher purpose, not only for profits. There are some companies like that also.
Yeah, no, see, that you can try and have, but ultimately one problem of course is that the structure of the corporation is such, when you have large number of shareholders and you have a manager, so to say, or a few managers of that company, then ordinarily managers are judged only on the basis of the bottom line. Of course, if all the shareholders became such, if the whole society became such that everybody became selfless, then certainly all the manner in which these corporations operate would also change. Perhaps you won't even need corporations then. Everything would be run by cooperatives, etc. However, you won't even need this profit motive, so to say. But even if you succeed in making corporations work more honestly with greater social responsibility, you still need a government because all kinds of public issues are involved. For example, whether genetically modified foods should be allowed or not. Is it a decision which needs to be taken by the entire community? It's not a decision which can be left to a company. A company having a patent on BT brinjal would certainly want to introduce BT brinjal. But if that poses similarly nuclear power, there are all kinds of issues, law and order. So therefore, in any orderly running of society, you do need public authorities, and because wherever the stakes are of a large section of society, whenever any issue or any decision involves large sections of society, there has to be some method of taking a decision in a fair and democratic manner. The method that has been currently devised is this method of voting for the representatives and then those representatives forming the government and that government deciding these issues. What we are saying is that this system of democracy has remained very incomplete and quite defective, and we need to cure these defects or at least improve the functioning of this democracy by firstly decentralizing power to the lowest level so that decisions which involve, say, only a village should be taken by the people of that village. Why should they be taken at a higher level? And as far as possible, as far as practicable, decisions should be taken directly by the people rather than by their elected representatives. That would be a much more fair and democratic system. That's what we are.
It's not a question. So on behalf of the whole SOIL students, we all would like to thank you for spending your valuable time here. And it really has sensitized our mind to a much great extent now, because it also troubles us as a youth of the country, because one side we say that we are the youngest nation, and on the other side of the coin, if you see, as you said, that we are on the brink of anarchy, that is really troublesome. And now we are trying to compare ourselves down there after 5 years to be like Pakistan. It really hurts to us, and the confidence which you have showed us that we can do something and you are ready for guiding us has really, built our confidence also in us. And those fearlessness shown by Arvind Kejriwal and all, we also want to contribute to your movement to a great extent. And the passion which you have showed even at this age and for a bigger cause to see a better India. We have seen this for the second time because we had Shazi also in our Inspired Leadership Conference. So we have we believe in your movement and we see a good time to come for India. So thanks a lot from the whole Student Council, and now I request Adel sir to have a speak word.
To the thanks which has been proposed by Devendra, let me add my own. Normally, a lecture on leadership series is entirely driven by the students. And the introduction, vote of thanks, everything is, arrangements, everything are done by them. But looking at your eminence and the kindness which you have shown to us, the students, out of their love for me, asked me to propose the vote of thanks to you. And I, in turn, since you can understand the sacrosanct bond which students have with their professors, I wanted to share this privilege with them. So I asked them first to have the first go. During the course of your address, you have raised some extremely important issues. One is certainly the concern of growing inequality in our society. The second is the destruction of natural resources which is taking place. Both these issues are now well documented. But in your inimitable style, you also touched upon intergenerational equity. And as you went on, you also talked about the need for administrative, police and judicial reforms. We all do agree with you that we need a more participatory democracy in our country. Indeed, as we look at some of the more mature democracies of the world, we find people play at every level. People are much more engaged and involved than they are in our own country. I would only like to add at the end that we are extremely grateful to you, sir, for having spared time for us from your hectic, valuable schedule, extremely busy schedule. Your time, we understand, is extremely valuable. And I know for a fact how difficult it is for you to accommodate people. Yet you have done so. And we deem it a great privilege that you have come to our institute and graced it. Thank you so very much. I will now call upon two of my valuable colleagues, Professor Bhattacharya and our Executive Director, Mr. Shailendra Kumar, to give a small memento as a token of our gratitude.